First, let me welcome everybody. This is the best breakout session ever. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. So first, this is about building a marketplace for shared services. And we've got a panel of experts here. We're going to talk a little bit about the Shared Service Roundtable. So the Shared Service Roundtable was something that came about a year ago. So I work for the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And part of our charter is to help improve government efficiency and effectiveness. So one way we thought we needed to, space we needed to get into was helping drive shared services across government. It's been a long journey, but we decided to convene a group of people, roundtable. So 10 private sector companies joined us, as well as 8 federal shared service providers. And then we have advisors as well from OMB, GSA, and various other government functional agencies. We meet once a month, and we come up with a series of recommendations to how can we create a federal shared service marketplace. And I'll use this horrible analogy, but just think of shared services now as like a farmer's market, and not a big one. So one where you go to and you're not really sure where the apples come from, what truck they fell off, or whether it has any standards, or whether the milk is homogenized, or any of that sort of stuff. And then think more of a supermarket, where you can go in and everything, there's standards, there's a methodology, things are laid out in the right places, and you can do one-stop shopping for whatever you want, like a Wegmans or a Target. So not just one line of business or one shared service, but a marketplace of all the shared services in one place where people can go, providers and suppliers. So that was the concept and that was the idea. And we actually published a little set of recommendations. We're a nonprofit, so this isn't in a 3-ring binder, but it's on our website. And it basically comes down to 10 recommendations that work groups came up with. And we were very fortunate to have 3 very prestigious panel members here who lead these work groups, or lead 3 of the work groups. So let me start from the other end. So John Sindelar, just to mess it up a little bit. I'm a little worried the room isn't wild and crazy.
He's going to say his name is Tony.
Yeah. So John is principal of the Sindelar Group, and I said before he has so many things at the end of his name we couldn't put it all on the sheet. But he's also a senior advisor to government executives. So these are former C-suite executives who work with the partnership to help federal agencies pro bono. And he is also a former deputy associate administrator at the GSA. And I think I got all that right. And then Catherine Knist is a principal at Booz Allen Hamilton. And I'm going to ask each of them to talk a little bit about the groups that they lead. And then Tony Towns-Whitley is also the senior VP at CGI, as well as the chief operating officer. So let me kick this off real quick with ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you do on this roundtable thing and what groups that you're currently working on.
Okay, thank you. The day job with CGI is a bit of a passion around this topic because CGI operates as a shared service provider commercially. We support government agencies as well as we have IP that supports the overall process. So that's the passion for the subject. On the roundtable itself, I lead the business case working group. So you'll hear with my colleagues that we each have working groups. Those working groups are really formed to answer the 5 question words of why, who, how, when, those kinds of words. So we're answering the why. Why shared services? Why now in this particular time frame? What are some of the business case opportunities for the federal government? So that's the role that I'm playing on the roundtable.
And as Mark said, I'm Catherine Knist, and I'm a principal at Booz Allen. I'm in the Strategic Innovation Group, focused on new service delivery models enabled by digital technology, and shared services is certainly a focus within that. I've been working, by the way, his other title is Godfather of Shared Services, and I think he has a hashtag, I'm not sure. But anyway, so I've been working in federal shared services since the 2004, 2005 lines of business and all the great work that John did. And so it has been kind of a personal passion of mine as well. Within the Shared Services Roundtable, I'm leading the performance metrics team. And as a part of that team, I'm looking to look at evaluating the exchange of value for money. And it's not necessarily cost savings, but it could be cost avoidance. There's a lot of intangibles. What are the quantifying the qualitative benefits of shared services to really see the long-term value in the transformation, and then to put together a common set of performance metrics to facilitate interoperability, transition in, transition out, and really help customers and providers find the right match for each other.
Thank you, Catherine. John Sindelar from Sindelar Group, LLC. I have been involved with shared services for many years. Back when I was with General Services Administration, I was the day-to-day boots-on-the-ground project leader for something called Quicksilver at the time, which established, working with the agencies, the eGov initiatives, some of which are going on today that Robert Shea talked about this morning. And then also after that, the lines of business effort for Karen Evans. So I've been a passionate advocate for shared services, which has given me great pleasure to be able to work with these fine people. And with the Partnership for Public Service Roundtable, working with Mark and others, my specific role as a SAGE in the partnership is to work with the governance group, and we've been doing that. You heard Joe Ward speak, excuse me, Joe Ward speak this morning. He's the chair of that group, and so I've had a good time and a learning experience working with Joe. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all. And I think we also have a member or two of the Shared Service Roundtable in the room. If you just want to stand up and say, hey, I'm Kevin, I'm on the Shared Service Roundtable.
Hey.
All right, so he's also, and is anybody else? No? Okay, the last session we had 2 or 3 folks as well, and I forgot to introduce them. So John, you talked about, you've been doing this, since Quicksilver was named after you.
Since God was a little girl.
So why do we think we can do this now? This shared.
I turn the question around and say why shouldn't we do it now?
Okay.
Because of the lessons that we've learned over the 20 years, if it's been that long. And also, I think you heard this morning that with technology and advances we've made, shared services is much more enabled by the improvements we've made in technology. Secondly, we've got budget constraints that we have to deal with. We've got lessons learned from the payroll and other shared service initiatives that are underway and have been going on for a long time. And as it was also said, the workforce is retiring. So the opportunities to address those issues, shared services, make a lot of sense. And in my mind, and I think everybody would agree on up here anyway, that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to chime in on that, I agree. It's definitely the budget constraints, the technology, but a key thing that we've been finding is shared services are stood up for a couple different reasons. One is for transaction volume and cost savings. Another is around subject matter expertise, and that's where John was talking about losing some of the institutional knowledge. We really need to figure out how to consolidate some of that so that we can continue to give good service quality to our customers.
And I guess rounding out the thought process is when we benchmark globally, other countries, other governments are figuring this out as well. And in fact, some have eclipsed us in understanding not only the cost savings, but the mission enhancement that can occur with shared services, whether we look at the UK, Australia, Canada, and different models. So it's becoming more of a standard way of service provision. I think the expectations of the taxpayer in interacting, if you will, citizen to government are going up. The standard of service and expectation is going up, is increasing as the budgets are coming down. So it's not just doing more with less, it's doing different with less and doing it with different models. And so I think shared services fits as a potential gap filler for all of those expectations.
Yeah, so I think there's and also let me just say, ask a question anytime during this session. We want this to be as interactive as possible. Don't wait till we're done for questions. If you have one, just raise your hand and stand up, and I'll call on you. Okay. So we know the time is now. If not now, when? If not who? Right. Mm-hmm. So what are the key barriers? Why haven't we done it? Why? Yeah. Why haven't we done it?
Quickly. This is not Jeopardy, Captain. Go right ahead.
So I think, again, and I feel fairly passionate about this, that technology is the easy part, right? People are the hard part. And so people are the resistance to change is what we really need to figure out how to do. And one of the drivers behind the resistance to change is just, fundamental 1776 stuff and the appropriations law and people not wanting to move, jobs out of their constituencies, and it all just tangles together into a very complex web. But we do need to figure out how to detangle that web and make these changes possible.
Yeah, I think that's probably a key barrier is the funding.
The funding, yep.
Tony, any?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that the funding piece is a combination of understanding the capital investment and how agencies can really participate in migrating folks onto a shared service, modernizing a shared service that exists, or creating a new shared service play. And we don't have an alignment with appropriated dollars and agencies being able to fund those costs. So I think that's one structural issue that we have to address. The second issue that we talk about is governance, and I'll let John speak to that. That's one of the groups he's led. But imagine the shared service provider that has the dual-hatted supervisory roles of running a shared service, and whether that shared service is aligned to the department that it's in. If you don't have some sustained executive sponsorship commitment, you can see over year where that multi-year commitment starts to wane. And then lastly, I think one of the barriers that Catherine speaks to passionately is we continually talk about this idea that with shared service, whether it's transactional back office, is going to allow people to move to the mission and focus more on the mission. But I don't think we've contextualized what that means. What does it mean that people are no longer doing X and doing Y? First of all, I don't think the turn happens that immediately. I think there's a change management underpinning that. And second, what is the next level of mission expectation, service level that we have for those agencies that have taken on shared services? So we don't have a way of measuring that very well. And so I think we have it conceptually, but we haven't really laid out what does that look like. And I think that's, again, one of the barriers. But you've been all over the governance topic, John, so I know that's part and parcel.
I mean, when we started the shared service effort, and you can even go back to GSA and look, they're basically a shared service, right? Particularly from an acquisition standpoint and a building standpoint. But shared services has grown up, shared service providers have grown up in sort of an uneven fashion, which is kind of how government initiatives get started and sort of grow over time. So they've been somewhat uneven. And what we're talking about is trying to build a more common standard, common environment, a way of doing the shared service provisioning a little more on a business basis, but realizing that the difficulty here is government is risk averse. It tends to, from a public policy standpoint, turn square corners, meaning that it has social implications, and again, it's risk averse. So moving from where we're at today to make it more efficient as a program overall, whether you're talking about financial management or you're talking about HR and any of the other shared services, it's a slow process, and it's a process that will come because in order to get the quality that we need and from a customer standpoint as well as a shared service provider standpoint and as a taxpayer, it's going to take time, and it's going to take groups like this roundtable to help drive it.
Well, that's a pretty good point, and I think, Tony, you're about to make a point.
No, I was just...
Oh, you have a question? Yes, ma'am.
Well, are you going to go to the microphone?
No, you can just talk. You can project.
I speak pretty loudly. I'm Ann Laurent from ASI Government. Full disclosure, I've also worked at CGI Federal and the Partnership for Public Service. I don't know.
Okay.
Draw your conclusions.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Ann.
I have a different kind of a question. I mean, because we've been talking in a lot of these different rooms about the challenges and about why we're not there yet and all those kinds of things. So I was actually involved in the partnership with some work about a different sort of focus on shared services. And I'm also involved at ASI with the acquisition of the future movement, as it were, creating a movement of acquisition professionals from the very highest level down to some aspiring young folks to try to envision what acquisition will look like in 2030 and how we get there. So what I would like to hear from you all, or from everybody really, is I'm having a difficult time envisioning what we're talking about a lot of the time when we're talking about shared services, expansion. I know what we're talking about when we're talking about lines of business and little different things that are around that. But when we were working on enterprise government and also on some shared delivery work at the partnership, we weren't talking about back office. We weren't focusing our entire conversation about back office functions. We were talking about things like, well, let's look at mission delivery shared services. What about, the nascent efforts, not nascent, but it's still struggling effort along the lines of geospatial? A mission function, sharing that service across the agencies that do it. I was talking with some folks at FEMA at the flood insurance program, and one of their main things is mapping, right? And mapping floodplains. There's a ton of agencies involved in mapping floodplains. And so OMB has said, I want a budget cross-cut for mapping flood zones, okay? How many of y'all are doing it? What are you spending on it? I mean, why aren't we lifting this discussion to a different place? There's an awful lot of shared, at DHS, they were looking at a couple of pilots. What does DHS do a lot of? Well, they do a whole lot of inspection, don't they? Well, is there, what's shared about that function? And it's not just DHS. What if we did disability claims processing, for God's sake? Now that's one that practically every agency's got some kind of a piece in. If we did it that way, what then would we be talking about shared back office functions as well? Because there's another piece of this. We talk a lot about in acquisition. Is it really fair for us to say that the acquisition function is the same no matter what we're acquiring? Is it the same to buy IT as it is to buy tables for TSA to open up your bag and put the stuff on with the rounded corners so the guys and gals don't jam themselves and hurt themselves while they're doing it? It's high and low enough to handle disabilities and whatnot. Are those the same skills, really? Or buying, office supplies or whatever? But why so, that kind of militates against this, peanut butter, it's all just back office crap, who cares?
Yeah, I don't, yeah.
So I don't think
Okay, we got the question. All right, yeah. I think we got it.
I'm just looking at get out there and imagine a little bit.
We are actually, so it is more than just back office with the Roundtable. And geospatial has come up as well as pushing the envelope. There's a whole group that's looking at what is the next gen sort of shared service lines of business that could be out there. But I'll let Catherine or John.
Yeah, well, and again, I appreciate your passion, and I think, pull up a chair because it's going to take all of us to get it done, right? Back office is something that people can relate to. Mission is a little bit scarier. So as you look at maturity and moving, the ball forward, that's a little bit of an easier conversation. But we are not talking about mass consolidation of status quo. We really need to figure out, if we're, like the analogy somebody told me was, there was somebody that was continuing to figure out how the most efficient way to deliver ice to households, why somebody else was developing the freezer, right? And so we don't want to be in that situation. And so we need to get some incremental changes, but we need to get folks envisioning and figuring out what is the real innovative solution, including mission. And so looking at it from a maturity level, operational performance, but then the service enablement, the mission services is definitely something that's on the agenda, but you got to help with the change management. You need to keep people going along with you.
Basically, it's easier to do the back office things. They're more transaction focused. When you get into mission, you start getting into nuances of those missions that make it more difficult. Not to bore you too much, but if you look at the budget of the government, you can split it by
He brought it with him.
I'm sitting on it. By functions. Okay, so there's many redundancies within those functions, which is the nature of the function itself, is to group like services from a budgetary standpoint. So the government has grown up since the Hoover Commission in response to a Cold War, where we took the expertise and put them in these structures so that we would have that expertise to fight the Cold War and have, no matter what the nuances were related to those structures. We've had those stovepipes ever since, and actually before that. So what shared services is trying to do is start easy by taking the easy things like
Easy,
financial
yeah.
management and
Yeah, the easy stuff.
and HR and so forth, which have all grown up in their little complexities, and slice across that to do more of a horizontal cut rather than a vertical cut. And that's where we're at today. But I think Tony is now going to wax eloquent on some of the things that we've looked
She's
at.
going to say what we
from-
said, but way better.
Way,
and
way
more.
better.
No pressure. Thank
In less
you.
words,
Yeah,
too.
yeah, you knew that question.
So with that, there's a nice segue for you.
Thank you. You can see there's a little gang up here. That's okay. I think we have to go to the definition of a marketplace to answer your question. The reason we selected that word on purpose, because within that marketplace, there are dimensions of product, services, and models for how those are delivered. I think that the biggest risk we have is to get into the either-or conversation. It is a both-and conversation. And I think we have to consciously decide to not go down that rat hole, because we'll never get out of it. So do we need, if you look at the existing lines of business, could we increase the number of services offered in shared services and even the existing lines of business? That's one dimension that we would argue, yes, we've had an HR line of business. Does it provide some of the disability? One might look at an existing line of business and say, couldn't that be provided? So let's look at existing. Let's look at the lines of business that haven't even been introduced around data center management, around unified communications. Some of the work of the Roundtable is what are the things that should be in a shared, that aren't even right now being done and that have huge potential not only for savings but for mission enhancement. So we know that in the marketplace there are transactional activities that's sometimes easier to identify in a budget, put our hands around, but we're not actually doing that well even on the transactional side. So let's not kid ourselves. One is not easier, fundamentally, they're just different. And we start in places we put our hands around. Beyond that, the question then might be, you talk about geospatial, how do we measure the outcome, which is really not about cost savings, it's more about some cost avoidance, but we're trying to stay in front of a market with technology and capability where agencies are able to say, hey, I can now share in a single investment that's being made by a single agency. I can share in that, and I can optimize by my understanding of geospatial technology. So I think that the challenge we have is that the demand side of the equation is also changing. This is not demand is stagnant, supply is shifting. Both sides of the equation are shifting. And so in the marketplace, the goal would be expand what we have, add new, make sure we're on the mission side, and know what it means to be on the mission side in terms of how do you measure the improvement. And I think all of that's part of the marketplace, which is why in any one conversation we can be easily pushed down into a single box. We have to keep words like marketplace, ecosystem, interaction, exchange, those kinds of words so that they discriminate from what would be a more simplistic model. And it's not a simple model. And so this sort of multivariate equation that we're all holding in our heads, we've got to keep all the variables on the table. And so that's where I think you've got the right point. But let's all use words that depict what we're really trying to get to.
And it's very interesting when you talk about the marketplace, it has three key principles, right?
Yeah.
Innovation, scale, and competition. So whatever this marketplace is, it needs to be innovative, it needs to be scalable, and it needs to increase the ability for competition. It sounds like a lot, and one of the things that we're struggling with is who's going to run this thing? Or should anybody run this thing? So you've got this, let's say we have a shared service marketplace that has all the lines of business plus maybe mission-driven service delivery. What was that called, Ann? Service delivery transformation, something like that. It has all that. Who should be in charge, or should anybody?
You.
Yeah, now passing it down the row. Yeah.
Godfather.
yeah.
What we're looking at in the governance group is three different models, though they have the same objective, basically. One model is to take the shared service providers today and move them lock, stock, and barrel under a current existing management agency. Don't shake your head. No, you haven't heard anything else yet.
There's three more options.
Vote visibly.
One option is leave everything like it is. You want to hear the other models, or you want to ask your questions?
I want to hear the other model first.
Okay. Second model would be sort of a matrix approach, which would be the policy and management function for the shared service providers would be managed by responsible for by current management agency, government-wide.
I mean, an existing agency.
Existing, thank you. The third option is create a new legal organization, legal-based, called the Office of Federal Shared Services, just as an example. Those are three different options. They all have advantages, and they have, obviously, have some disadvantages. One of them that would be an advantage in all three of them is right now, each of the shared service providers does have some conflict of interest with their parent agency. And I'll give you an example. Let's take Joe's Operation Interior. If there's a budget cut to Interior, and it has to be across the board, or let's take the furlough. Some shared service providers had to furlough their folks, others did not. Budget cuts, do they get evenly distributed, even though the mission of the shared service provider is government-wide to their clients versus Department of Interior? Bottom line is, if I'm the secretary or the deputy secretary, am I making choices on programs for a Department of Interior versus a shared service provider? There's an inherent conflict of interest there. So each of these models would tend to eliminate more than some. The matrix approach, I think there would still be some conflict of interest with the parent agency. The moving to a management agency from a virtual standpoint, the matrix approach, a lot less expensive than moving them lock, stock, and barrel. So they would stay in place. Essentially, you would have one focus for accountability, membership already in the interagency councils, budgetary authority that agency has. One I have in mind has a revolving fund authority. So there are a lot of advantages. There are some disadvantages. For instance, in the Office of Federal Shared Services, you don't have that infrastructure. You'd have to stand that up. There would be a cost associated with that. So those are the three models that we're looking at. And the other option is to work on the margins and make some improvements that the other groups are talking about doing to the shared service model.
Good question.
Question?
Yeah.
You still have a question?
I really appreciate the different perspectives that you guys all bring to this, the history and the passion and the nuance that all three of you bring. A question I have is that I moved from the Department of Defense to the Department of Transportation
Right.
6 years ago. And I had lived from 1990 all the way up to 2008 when I moved through exactly this cultural change, but it was driven at the very top by the BRAC, Base Reliable Program. Is that the type of top cover that made, and I'm not saying DOD did it perfectly, but they did exactly the model you said. They tried to have the services consolidate, and they wouldn't do it.
Right.
So they just built new agencies inside. Of course, DOD's huge, but they had to build the Defense Information Systems Agency, Defense Logistics Agency, Defense Finance and Accounting Service, because the services would never play well together in terms of shared service model. So they just built agencies inside, and they said, move your stuff there, and the budget will follow. Is that? I mean, I know in the other executive departments, it's far more complex because of corporations and everything else. But that model, at least at a certain level, reduced the number of data centers from 320 some odd to 16 in a matter of about 4 years.
Right.
And the standing savings were about $1 billion a year on it with then technology, and of course it's larger now. So my question is, what is it the political environment that makes the non-DOD agencies? And again, I'm not saying DOD has got the answer, but I do know that we did, over a period of about 16 to 18 years, do everything we're talking about here, but we had to go to that. We couldn't live with the hybrid model. They would have never done it. And the money followed. So I guess I'd like your perspective on what would it take on the non-DOD side to follow that same model.
I'm going to let Catherine is chafing at the bit to answer this, but from my perspective, the last one is the easiest, and that is an Office of Federal Shared Services. To me, it's a lot cleaner. You build in the flexibilities that you're going to need. You won't have a 4% cap on franchise funds, for example. Working capital fund doesn't work. I would like to see an Office of Federal Shared Services with a lot of HR flexibilities built into it for a high-performing organization, establish the metrics that are needed. The worry is always when Congress legislates something, there's so many holes in it in terms of how it actually gets implemented and the report language supporting it and so forth. But to me, that seems to be the cleanest way to go. So, yes.
So just on that, because option number 3 seems like the most unsatisfactory, just in my opinion, just because of the fact that where is the diversity? Where's the competition? Would you be saying that there's only one provider?
No.
Would this Office of Shared Services have multiple providers of HR and
They'd have multiple providers.
Well, back
as
to
they
the
have
marketplace.
today. Right. You would still have competition, you have multiple providers. I would think over time you would increase where you've got expertise in one provider, you'd have increased specialization in that provider, so you wouldn't necessarily have as much competition inside. Because the idea at the end of the day is to reduce your redundancy, right? Isn't that what we're really talking about here in government?
it is,
For common.
You also don't have the bureaucracy, right, above it, that's
Right.
the highway or the highway.
Exactly.
You're also sharing information,
Right.
so it's transparent. within that.
And I couldn't agree more. You know, I came out of GSA and I came out of an era where we were a mandatory supplier. That doesn't work. You don't have one supplier. Even on a shared service for instance, for this Office of Federal Shared Services, you might have an equivalent at DOD and you might have an equivalent over at NASA. So you don't necessarily go down to one. You could, but the fear is government monopolies or monopolies of any kind really don't work very well in a free market.
Yeah, we agree. In front here, yes ma'am?
Yeah, I think this is really exciting. It's like that Uber Fit model, right? So we
Yeah.
take Fit, we call it an Uber
Yes.
Fit. And all of a sudden you have this organization that A, would have that appropriation, but B, would be able to leverage other opportunities, right? Because we know that in our existing shared service providers, they're also applying other regimens. They have program management offices that have been highly successful. They've learned through strength on what it's going to take to make a good program manager. So now you have another line that can be provided as a shared service. Because we know one of the biggest challenges in government today is to develop and retain top quality program management.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a problem, and it's not going away because frankly, I'm in private industry. You show me a good program manager, I'm going to hire them. All right? I will take them away from government if at all possible, because I need them.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
They're hard to build, so I think this is really exciting. And
The Uber Fit sort of thing, that's a new term. Maybe we start to trademark that or something, but part of the role and back there to address is that mediator type role that is actually value added in many respects for making an efficient purchase, right? So I don't know if you guys want to touch on that a little.
Well, I guess let me go back to UberFit before we brand it. Let's just think about it. I think that one of the key pieces is the autonomy of this role and the ability to look across government. I think the gentleman from DOD gave a very interesting example, having lived through the BRAC activity myself. There's a forcing function that said we're going to build up agencies that have leads that are peers in the market that can actually drive financial services and DOD are all going to be done in this manner or some. So I think the question is, even the FIT model right now sits within, does it have the full autonomy that could it? Right, so you can see what this idea here is really around the true ability to create the marketplace says that might need some non-traditional capabilities in that particular office, right? We talked about HR flexibility. We talk about CapEx franchise fund capability, the ability to look across the ability to determine from a performance perspective and maybe even change some of the OPM type expectations that are sitting on agencies. So when we talk about this, we haven't fully fleshed it out, but I think to John's point, it's not just business as you create another agency. This is really about defining what would be needed for a shared service kind of authority, autonomy, and governance going forward.
Measure each of the providers to ensure that they retain best practice, because as DoD well knows, DFAS is not necessarily customer-centric. So, because they only have a single financial provider, they've kind of grown into their own big monolithic agency and have stopped providing those levels of customer service that DoD absolutely needs. So that organization would be, I would hope, the entity that would help oversee whether or not those shared service providers retain that customer.
Well, there's a...
Well, yeah, I mean, that governance framework would have to be set up. I mean, the problem that we have today is this landscape is way too messy. And we're not going to be able to get from where we're going very easily by nibbling at the margins, so to speak.
Yeah, let me drop it down just for a second, because I want to give Catherine a shot, because there is a maturity model to the measures and the metrics that is absolutely critical to this whole idea. And I want to give you an opportunity next few minutes to...
Sure. So, regardless of which alternative or option we end up taking, though, it has to enable funding, flexible funding, and it has to enable innovation, because those are the things that are really going to make us successful. But as we step back and look at the performance metrics, what we're kind of looking at is from a maturity perspective. And so we have a phase one where we have operational management, and we have the server blinky lights are working, and somebody answered the help desk phone in 2 rings, and so very transactional operational metrics. What we want to do is move folks more toward the performance management, the efficiency and the productivity. What are some of the efficiencies that the government is gaining through this implementation of shared services, with the final eye on the target of going to phase 3, which would be strategic service enablement, really measuring the benefit that the mission is receiving by moving to this new service model. And so I think we need to, we have to fundamentally change, and we really do need to look at the impact on the mission, but it's going to be a maturity path to get there.
Right. That's an excellent point. Then I think in the back there was a question. Yes, sir.
John, you were talking earlier about the idea of an office of shared services, which I think might be more effective. Because when you look at the defense model, one of the things that is really an important player here is Congress. And if you look at those authorizing committees and determining how money is going to be spent, one reason why defense was able to do what it was doing is because it was one major committee that fell under. Whereas if you have various authorizing committees that are looking at how money is being spent, they all have ideas. And so the idea of having an office of shared services might at least keep the train moving in the right direction. Earlier today they were talking about working capital funds being bad, and I talked to people who were on working capital funds, and one of the things that they were constantly afraid of was building up the dollars that they need to replace capital expenditure. And if Congress were to see that, they see the extra money, they'll pull it. So by having that model of an office of shared services, it might help move the cause forward.
All right. Thank you for that. And I think we just got a second left. So Tony, do you want to?
Well, I guess I'll just bring us home. I will, let me wrap up with one of the, I think, more creative ideas coming out of the Roundtable that would couple with this idea, if we were going to go down the path of the Office of Federal Shared Service, is a demonstration pilot of sorts. A demonstration where the private sector would be engaged to look at and to take on the upfront cost of migrating into a shared service, the upfront cost that agencies cannot take on. And so this idea that we would demonstrate the CapEx part of this, which is always a challenge for the agency, we would determine what that ROI and, if you will, payback period would be for the private sector to look at standing up and to also show perhaps a gold standard around some of the kinds of metrics that Catherine's talked about, operational efficiencies, but demonstrate it with a public-private opportunity and a competitive landscape so private sector could determine what's the kind of investment they'd be interested in making in this space. Right now we're conceptual, but we don't have a lot of demonstrable metrics to see how would we engage private sector in a better way, even though we know that private sector is supporting many of the shared services, if not all, existing. What's the gold standard for future for how to acquire, how to set up the right funding, what the payback would look like for the private sector, and how to demonstrate gold standard service. So that's really one of the recommendations coming out that's being fleshed in terms of a demonstrable pilot that the private sector could engage with.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And so just in closing, I like to always quote John Gibson, who he was crazy, but he had a nice quote. And it was, change has already happened, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I think that's where we are, and that's what the Roundtable is trying to do, is evenly distribute the change and the pace of change across the shared service spectrum. So first, let me thank our panel, distinguished panel. Thank you very much. Great comments. And you can join us in the green room later for, no, we're all done.